$1 million, the trader said, slapping the table so the crystal jumped. Says the busboy can't read a chart. The private dining room went bright with laughter. 12 of the richest men on Wall Street, deep in a bottle of something older than the man they were laughing at, turned to look at the figure in the black service vest, standing quietly by the wall with a tray of empty glasses. Tommy Herrera, 46. The man who had refilled their water 3 times that night without a single one of them meeting his eyes. Preston Vane spun his tablet around on the white tablecloth, a live chart glowing on the screen, and jabbed a finger at it. Come on, amigo. Tell the table one intelligent thing about this chart and I'll write you a check for $1 million right now. One thing. Or admit you people are good for carrying plates and nothing else. Tommy set down his tray. He walked to the table, unhurried, in the way of a man who has learned that the only dignity they can't take is the speed at which you move. He looked at the chart on the screen for exactly 1 second, maybe 2. And then he said 9 words that wiped the smile off Preston Vane's face, because they were 9 words no busboy should have been able to say, and because they were true, and because the position glowing on that screen belonged to Preston himself, and Tommy had just told him, in front of the whole table, exactly how he was about to lose everything. Preston laughed. The table laughed. They were still laughing 40 minutes later when Preston's phone began to ring, and ring, and ring, and the color drained out of his face in real time while a quiet man in a black vest picked up a tray of empty glasses and carried it, without a word, back toward the kitchen. How does a busboy read a billionaire's ruin in a single glance? You have to go back, 12 years back, to the day they took everything from Tommy Herrera, except the one thing they never understood he had. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if the world has ever looked at you and seen only the uniform, subscribe. You'll want to see how this one ends. There's a private room, 40 floors above the trading pits of Lower Manhattan, that does not appear on any menu and does not take reservations from anyone whose name you would recognize unless you already knew to recognize it. The Exchange Club, dark wood, older money, a wine list that reads like a history of European wars. It is where Wall Street goes to be Wall Street, with no one watching, no clients, no cameras, no press, and for 6 years, the man who cleared their plates and refilled their glasses and became, to all of them, a piece of the furniture was Tomas Herrera. He was 46. He wore the black vest they gave him, and he kept it immaculate, because his father, a long time ago and a long way from here, had taught him that a man with nothing still controls the shine of his own shoes and the cleanliness of his own collar. He moved through that room like weather, present and unremarked, and he did his job so well that the men who ate there had, over 6 years, stopped seeing him entirely. That was the point of a man like Tommy, as far as they were concerned. You do not want to see the person who removes what you leave behind. It reminds you that you leave things behind. What not one of them knew, not one, in 6 years, was that the busboy refilling their Bordeaux could read the market moving on the screens behind the bar better than any of them. That while he cleared the plates, he was doing, silently and continuously, the exact thing they were paid millions to do, and doing it better. That Tommy Herrera possessed a gift so rare that in another life, a life that had been taken from him, men had called him a prodigy before they called him something else. Let me show you the gift, because you have to understand it to understand everything that follows. It was not magic. It was not luck. It was the thing that happens when a certain kind of mind meets 10,000 hours of a certain kind of pain. Tommy could look at a chart, the raw price of a thing moving through time, and see, underneath the noise, the story. Not predict the future, no one can do that. But read the present with a clarity that felt, to the people who witnessed it, like prophecy. He could see where the fear was hiding. He could see the exact price at which the confident men would panic, because he understood, in his marrow, that markets are not made of numbers. They are made of people, and people are made of fear and greed, and the specific arrogance of men who have won for so long they have forgotten they can lose. Tommy read the numbers, but what he was really reading was the men. On a slow Tuesday, months before the night of the bet, one of the club's regulars, a hedge fund manager named Ellery Cole, one of the few who had ever bothered to learn Tommy's name, was staring at his phone with the particular stillness of a man watching money evaporate. Tommy, clearing the next table, saw the chart over his shoulder without meaning to. He saw the whole shape of it in half a breath, and because Ellery was one of the 2 or 3 human beings in that room who had ever treated him as a person, Tommy did something he almost never did. He paused, and he said, very quietly, so no one else could hear, "It's not breaking down, Mr. Cole. It's shaking out the weak hands. Whoever's selling stops at that round number down there, and then it reverses. But that's just what I see." And he moved on with his tray. Ellery Cole stared after him. Then he looked back at his phone, and 40 minutes later the thing did exactly, precisely, uncannily what the busboy had murmured it would do, down to the round number. And Ellery Cole did not sleep well that night because he had just watched a man in a service vest read the market like scripture, and he could not stop wondering what in God's name that man was doing carrying his plates. To understand what that man was doing carrying plates, you have to go back 12 years, to a different Tommy Herrera, younger, hungrier, wearing a suit instead of a vest, sitting on a trading desk at a firm called Ashford Bell, the first in his family to touch that world, and the best natural trader anyone there had ever seen. He had come up from nothing. A kid from a neighborhood these men flew over, who had taught himself the markets on library computers and a borrowed textbook, who had clawed and studied and interviewed his way onto a desk where everyone else had a father who had golfed with the hiring partner. And he had been, quietly, brilliantly, better than all of them. They tolerated him the way an old house tolerates a draft, as an irritation they could not quite locate and could not quite close. And then, in the winter of his 4th year, Tommy Herrera saw something on that desk that he was not supposed to see. A senior trader, a made man named Grant Whitfield, was running a scheme, front-running client orders, a fraud precise and profitable and deeply illegal, the kind of thing that ends in headlines and handcuffs. Tommy saw it the way he saw everything, in the numbers, in the pattern that did not fit. And Tommy, who believed in those days that being right was the same as being safe, did the honest thing. He documented it. He took it to compliance. He tried to stop it. You already know how this ends, because you have been paying attention, and because the world is very consistent about who it protects. Grant Whitfield had a name, a pedigree, a decade of relationships, and a lawyer on retainer. Tommy Herrera had an accent and a library computer education, and no one in the room who owed him anything. So when the scheme finally cracked open, and it did, months later, too big to hide, the firm did what firms do. It found the version of the story that cost the powerful the least. And in that version, the fraud was not Grant Whitfield South. It was the ambitious immigrant kids, the outsider who never quite fit. They built the paper trail around him with the same cold competence Tommy had once admired, and they handed him to the regulators like a gift. And the men who had actually done it stood in the back of the room and watched a scapegoat carry their sin out the door. Tommy fought. God, he fought. But a man fighting the truth with only the truth, against people who own the story, and the lawyers and the assumptions of everyone in the room, is a man drowning in a lake while being told the water is his own fault. He was barred from the industry. His trading license, the thing he had bled for, was stripped. He was never criminally convicted. The case against him was too thin for even a bought court to close. But he did not need to be convicted. The whisper was enough. Blackballed, tainted. The Herrera kid, you heard about that. Nasty business. And a whisper, on Wall Street, is a life sentence, because that world does not run on verdicts. It runs on who they'll let back in the room. And they would never, ever let Tommy Herrera back in the room. It cost him everything a man can lose that isn't his life. The savings went to the lawyers. The career was gone. And his wife, who had believed him, who had never once doubted that he was innocent, but who could not live inside the slow suffocation of a name that opened no doors, and a husband who woke at 3 in the morning with his fists clenched, His wife, finally, tenderly, left, not out of cruelty, out of exhaustion. She took their young daughter to another city and a cleaner life, and Tommy let them go because he loved them and because he could not stand to watch his stain spread onto them too. That is a thing the powerful never understand about the people they ruin. They think the damage stops at the career. It doesn't. It goes all the way down. There was one more weight, and it was the heaviest. And it is the reason Tommy Herrera swallowed 12 years of insults instead of walking away from that room the first night. A man like Preston Vane sneered at his vest. His mother, Rosa Herrera, had crossed a border with nothing and cleaned other people's houses for 30 years so that her son could sit in a library and teach himself the thing that would carry him up and out. And she had lived just long enough to see him rise, and then just long enough to see him fall. And she did not fully understand the fall, because how do you explain to a woman who scrubbed floors for 3 decades that her brilliant, honest boy was being punished precisely for being honest? In her last years, her mind softened and her body failed, and she needed a kind of care that costs, in this country, more than most people earn. And there was exactly one person to pay for it, and he had a whisper following him that closed every good door. So Tommy took the doors that were left, and when the position at the Exchange Club came open, steady, with tips, a short bus ride from the facility where his mother spent her days looking out a window, he took it, and he told himself the location was an accident, and he was lying, and he knew he was lying, and he took it anyway, because love makes liars of us in the small ways so that we can be faithful in the large ones. So he clung to that job the way a drowning man clings to a plank, and he let them talk to him however they liked, and every dollar of every insult went to a small clean room where an old woman who had crossed a border with nothing got to die with dignity, in comfort, with her son's hand in hers on the last afternoon. She never knew about the journal. She never knew that the son clearing rich men's plates was, in the dark, one of the finest market minds of his generation. But on that last afternoon she held his hand and she said, in the language they had left a country speaking, "Mijo, you were always the smartest one in every room. Don't let them make you forget it." And Tommy, 45 years old, in a black vest he had come straight to the facility still wearing, put his head down on his mother's hand and wept, because she was the only person left alive who had never once, not for a single second, believed the whisper. She died that night, and the club job, which he had taken for her, he kept, because by then it was simply his life, and because some stubborn wounded part of him still needed to stand in that room and be right where they couldn't see it, the way you keep pressing on a bruise long after you've forgotten why it hurts. So how did the best trader anyone at Ashford Bell had ever seen end up in a black vest, clearing the plates of the very men who had cast him out? Slowly, the way all of it happens. The years after the fall were a long descent through jobs that got smaller as the whisper followed him. And when the position at the Exchange Club came open, steady, near the room where his mother lived out her last years in a care facility that ate every dollar he could earn, Tommy took it, and he told himself the location was an accident. It was not entirely an accident. Some wounded part of him needed to be near it. The way a man will press on a bruise, he needed to stand in the room where they had all eaten so well while his life burned, and to prove to himself, every single night, that they had not taken the one thing that was actually his. The gift, the eye, the ability to read the tape that no license board could strip and no whisper could touch. Because here is what Tommy did. Every night, after the club closed and he had polished the last glass and folded the last cloth, he went home to a small, clean apartment, and he opened a battered laptop, and he traded. Not with real money. For years he had no real money, and the bar from the industry made a real account complicated. He traded on paper. A meticulous journal, 12 years deep, every call dated and logged, thousands of them. And in that journal, in the merciless honesty of numbers that cannot be whispered about, or scapegoated or bribed, Tommy Herrera was, quietly, one of the greatest traders of his generation. His paper account, had it been real, had he ever been allowed to touch a real one, would have made him rich many times over. The market, you see, never once asked his name. It did not care about his accent or his neighborhood or the whisper or the story the powerful had built around him. It cared about one thing and one thing only, which was whether you could see the truth. And Tommy could see the truth. And the market rewarded that truth in the pure indifferent language of a number going up. It was the only fair thing left in his life. And he clung to it like scripture. Let me tell you about one night in that journal, because it is the night that tells you what Tommy Herrera actually was. It was during a market panic, a real one, the kind that comes maybe once a decade, when the whole world seems to be selling at once, and every screen on Wall Street is a wall of red and grown men with pedigrees weep quietly in bathrooms. Tommy had watched it build for 3 days, not on a desk, but from the wall of the club, out of the corner of his eye, while pouring wine for men who were, some of them, being quietly destroyed even as they ordered another bottle. And on the third night, alone in his apartment at 2 a.m, Tommy wrote a single sentence in his journal, underlined twice. Tomorrow it bottoms at the open. They flush the last weak hand in the first 30 minutes, and then it turns and never looks back. It was the most contrarian call a human being could make. Every headline said the world was ending. Every expert on every screen said sell. And Tommy Herrera, a busboy with a battered laptop and no license and no money and no one to tell, wrote down that it would bottom at the open and turn, because he was not reading the headlines, he was reading the tape. And the tape was telling him that the selling had become a stampede. And stampedes, he knew, and not with a whimper but all at once, when the last frightened person finally sells to the first brave one. The next morning it bottomed in the first 30 minutes, flushed the last weak hand exactly as he had written, and turned, and never looked back. He made nothing. He had no money to make anything with. He simply closed the laptop, and got dressed, and went to work, and cleared the plates of men who had lost fortunes doing the opposite of what a busboy had known, for free, in the dark, at 2 a.m. That is the cruelty and the miracle of a gift like that in a life like his. The market kept a perfect, honest record of exactly how brilliant Tommy Herrera was, in the only language that cannot be bribed or whispered against. And the record grew, year after year, into a monument that no one but Tommy would ever see. Some men would have gone mad from it, from being that right, that consistently, and that invisible. But Tommy had made a kind of peace with it, or told himself he had. The journal was his church. Being right was his prayer. And if the congregation was empty, well, at least the God he prayed to had never once lied to him, and never once, not one single time in 12 years, asked to see his papers. It was the only fair thing left in his life, and he clung to it like scripture. Now let me tell you about Preston Vane, because a story like this needs its storm. And Preston was a storm that did not yet know it was about to break. Preston Vane was 40, and he had won for so long he had come to believe that winning was a quality of his character rather than a phase of a cycle. He ran a large book at a large fund, and for a decade the market had gone in the direction that made men like Preston look like geniuses. And he had mistaken that decade for his own brilliance, the way the loud always do. He was cruel in the specific way of men who have never been tested, a cruelty that was really just the absence of any experience that might have taught him humility. He humiliated waiters. He humiliated juniors. He humiliated, most of all, anyone whose presence reminded him that the world contained people who had less, because their existence was a rumor of a fate he refused to believe could ever touch him. And Tommy Herrera in his black vest was the most convenient reminder in the room. What Preston Vane did not tell the table, what he did not tell anyone, was that underneath the 10 years of swagger, he was sitting on a position that had grown too large to be brave and had become, instead, a kind of prayer. He had made an enormous, leveraged bet, the kind you make when a decade of being right has convinced you that you cannot be wrong. And the bet had started, quietly, to go against him. Not catastrophically. Not yet. Just enough that a wiser man would have felt the first cold breath of the thing. But Preston was not a wiser man. Preston was a man who had never once, in his life, had to read the tape honestly, because he had 100 people paid to do it for him, and a decade of luck that let him ignore them when they said something he didn't want to hear. He was long, and he was leveraged, and he was drinking to keep from feeling the floor tilt. And on the night of the bet, he was doing what frightened men do, performing certainty as loudly as possible, so that no one, least of all himself, would smell the fear. The night it happened was a celebration. Preston's desk had booked a big win that afternoon, a win that was, though he did not know it, the last exhale before the fall, and he had taken the whole table to the club to be worshipped. The wine was ancient and the talk was loud, and by 11 o'clock, Preston Vane was the drunkest and the loudest and the most certain man in the most certain room in the world. Tommy had been serving them all night, invisible as ever, refilling and clearing and moving like weather. And somewhere in the noise, Preston, needing an audience for his certainty, needing to feel large, found the busboy by the wall and decided to make him small. It started as it always started, a comment. Careful with that, it's worth more than your car. A laugh from the table. Tommy said nothing, nodded, moved on. But Preston was drunk and frightened underneath the drink, and a frightened man cannot leave a wound alone. He pushed. He mocked the vest. He mocked the accent, doing an impression that made two of the younger traders wince even as they laughed. And still Tommy said nothing, because Tommy had a mother in a care facility and a job that paid for her, and had learned, at the highest possible cost, exactly what happens to a man like him who talks back to a man like Preston in a room like that. And then Preston, casting about for the biggest way to make the small man smaller, pulled out his tablet and pulled up a chart, his chart, though no one at the table knew it, the live chart of his own enormous position. And he spun it around on the white tablecloth and said the thing that would end him. $1 million, says the busboy, can't read a chart. The room went bright with laughter. And Tommy Herrera, who had spent 12 years being told he was nothing by men who had never once been able to do the thing he did in his sleep, felt something that had been folded down very small and very quiet for a very long time slowly, calmly, stand up. He set down his tray. And he walked to the table. He should not have. Every instinct built by 12 years of survival screamed at him not to. But there are moments in a buried life when the price of staying buried becomes, all at once, higher than the price of standing up, and Tommy had reached his. He looked down at the chart glowing on the tablet on the white tablecloth, and he read it the way he read everything, in a single, unhurried glance. And in that glance, he saw not just a pattern, but a grave. He saw a position that was enormous and leveraged and quietly, fatally wrong. He saw the exact price sitting just below where the market was now, a price where the stops of every overconfident long would fire at once, a trapdoor. And he saw that the market was drifting toward it the way water drifts toward a drain. He saw, in short, the death of whoever owned this position, written plainly in the numbers for anyone willing to actually look. And then, because he was Tommy Herrera and the tape had never once lied to him, he did look at the small print in the corner of the screen, the account tag, and he understood, with a calm that felt almost like mercy, exactly whose grave he was looking at. He looked up at Preston Vane, and he said his 9 words, quietly, so the whole silent table could hear. "You're already dead. You just haven't gotten the call yet." The laughter cracked, uncertain, and then reassembled itself, louder, because that is what a room does when a servant says something that sounds like a threat. Preston's grin went hard. "Excuse me?" "That's your book," Tommy said, nodding at the tablet, still quiet, still calm. "You're long, you're leveraged, and there's a shelf of stops about 2% under the last price. When it touches, and it's going to touch, tonight, the flows are all one way. They all fire at once, and there's nobody underneath to catch it, because everybody at this table is on the same side of the boat. You don't get stopped out, Mr. Vane. You get liquidated, and then your fund gets a call, and then you do." He straightened. "You asked me to tell you one intelligent thing about the chart. That's it. You can keep the million." For one long, strange second, The room did not know whether to laugh, and in that second, something crossed Preston Vane's face that had never crossed it before, not once in a decade of easy winning, a flicker of pure animal doubt. Because, drunk as he was, some sober lizard part of his brain had heard the busboy describe his own secret fear out loud, in precise detail, with a certainty that no bluff could counterfeit. Then the wine won, and the ego won, and Preston laughed, a big performed laugh, and the table laughed with him, relieved.
"Get this guy a trading desk," Preston roared. "The busboy's a genius."
Somebody tip him, he earned it. He threw $100 bill on the floor, at Tommy's feet, and the table howled, and Tommy looked at the bill on the floor and did not pick it up. He picked up his tray of empty glasses instead, and he turned, and he carried it back toward the kitchen, and behind him the celebration roared on, and the market drifted, in the dark, another 0.25% toward the drain. It touched at 11:52. Somewhere out in the electronic dark, the price of Preston Vane's enormous, leveraged, overconfident bet drifted down and kissed the shelf of stops that Tommy Herrera had seen from across a dining room in a single glance. And they fired, all at once, exactly as he had said, a cascade, each forced sale knocking the price lower and triggering the next, a trapdoor opening under a decade of certainty. There was nobody underneath to catch it because everyone was on the same side of the boat. And the position that had been Preston's monument to his own genius became, in the space of 11 minutes, the instrument of his complete and total ruin. His phone rang at 11:58. He silenced it, laughing, mid-story. It rang again, and again. And by the fourth call, the laughter at the table had begun to curdle, because they were traders, all of them. And they knew what a phone that will not stop ringing at midnight means, and they watched Preston Vane finally, irritably, glance at the screen, and they watched the blood leave his face in real time as he saw the number of missed calls, and the number under the number, the loss, climbing, a figure with more zeros than any of them had ever seen, attached to a single man in a single night. He stood up too fast. His chair went over backward. He was talking now, fast and high, into the phone. "Sell it. Sell all of it. What do you mean there's no bid? There's no bid." And the ancient wine and the worshipping table and the certainty of a decade all fell away from him at once. And what was left standing in the middle of that beautiful dark room was just a frightened man, watching his whole life get the call that a busboy had told him was coming 40 minutes before. The table emptied fast, the way tables do around a man who has suddenly become radioactive. An hour earlier they had been his court, laughing at his jokes, drinking his ancient wine, echoing his certainty. Now they could not get their coats on quickly enough, because ruin on Wall Street is believed to be contagious, and none of them wanted to be seen standing too close to it when the story got out. And the story always gets out. One by one they made their excuses and fled into the elevators, leaving Preston Vane alone at a wrecked table strewn with the bones of a celebration, still on the phone, still saying the word bid like a prayer to a god who had stopped listening. The men who had laughed loudest at the busboy were the first out the door, and not one of them, on the way out, so much as glanced at the quiet figure clearing the glasses, because even now, even as the exact thing he had foretold destroyed the loudest man among them, they could not make the connection. The idea that the busboy had known was simply not a shape their minds could hold. It was easier to believe in bad luck than in a truth that had been standing against the wall in a black vest all night, refilling their water, seeing everything. And that, in the end, is the deepest cut of the whole story. Deeper than the fraud, deeper than the 12 years. Not that they had ruined Tommy Herrera, but that even when he proved, in front of all of them, in real time, that he could do the one thing they worshipped better than any of them alive, they still could not see him. A man can survive being hated. Being hated at least means being seen. It is being invisible that hollows you out. And Tommy had been invisible in that room for 6 years, and was invisible in it still, even on the night he read A Titan's Grave from across it. Tommy Herrera was in the kitchen when it happened, quietly loading a tray of glasses into the washer, and he did not smile, and he did not gloat, because he had learned 12 years ago that ruin is not sweet even when it is deserved, that it only looks sweet from a distance, and up close it is just a man drowning, the way Tommy himself had once drowned. But he did allow himself one thing. He allowed himself to stand very still, for just a moment, over the sink, and to feel the strange, quiet, enormous fact of it, that the eye they had tried to take from him, the gift they had scapegoated and blackballed and whispered into the ground, was still there, was still true, had just, without a license or a suit or a single person's permission, read the ruin of a Wall Street titan in a single glance across a room. The market never once asked my name, he thought, and it never lied to me, not once in 12 years. He thought that would be the end of it, a private, secret vindication, carried home in the dark and written in his journal and known to no one. But he had forgotten about Ellery Cole. Ellery Cole had been at the table, not laughing. Ellery rarely laughed at the club's cruelties, and was one of the few there with a conscience that still made noise, but present and watching. And Ellery Cole was the one man in that room who had already seen, months before, on a slow Tuesday, what the busboy could do. He had spent those months unable to forget it. And when Preston Vane's chair went over backward, and the impossible thing the busboy had said came true to the decimal, Ellery Cole did not feel the horror the rest of the table felt. He felt something closer to awe, and underneath the awe, a slow, dawning professional hunger, because Ellery Cole ran a fund, a real one, built on the radical Wall Street heresy of actually being right, rather than merely being connected, and he had just watched the most gifted market red of his entire career come out of the mouth of a man in a black vest that his industry had thrown away. He found Tommy in the alley behind a club at 1 a.m, after the wreckage had scattered, after Preston Vane had been half-carried into a car by 2 associates while screaming into a dead phone. Tommy was taking out the trash, in his coat now, his shift over, a tired man at the end of a long night. Ellery Cole approached him carefully, the way you approach something you don't want to startle. "That wasn't a guess," he said. "It wasn't a question. In there, what you did. That wasn't a guess, and it wasn't luck. I saw the one on Tuesday too. Who are you?" And Tommy Herrera looked at this man, one of the 2 or 3 in 12 years, who had ever asked him that question, as though the answer might matter, and he was so tired. And the night had cracked something open in him that he had kept sealed for a very long time, and so he told him. Not all of it, but enough. The name. Ashford Bell. Grant Whitfield. The fraud he had tried to stop and been buried under. The license. The whisper. The wife. The daughter in another city. The 12 years. And Ellery Cole, who had been on Wall Street for 30 years and knew exactly how that machine ate the powerless to protect the powerful, listened to the whole thing in the cold of the alley, and when it was done he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "I remember the Herrera case. Everyone said it was the immigrant kid." He looked at Tommy. "Nobody ever once said the immigrant kid might have been the only honest man on the desk. Would it have mattered?" Tommy asked. "Not bitter. Just tired." "No," Ellery admitted. 12 years ago it wouldn't have mattered at all." He was quiet again. Then, "But I'm not 12 years ago, and I run my own shop now, and I just watched you do something in that room that I have paid 7-figure salaries to men who couldn't do it once." He took out a card. "I can't give you back 12 years, Mr. Herrera. I can't give you back your wife, or the time with your daughter, or the name they stole. Nobody can. But I can do one thing the rest of this street will never do." He held out the card. "I can offer you the room." Tommy looked at the card and did not take it, not yet, because a man who has been ruined once by believing a promise does not reach for the next one quickly. "I'm barred," he said. "The license. The bar was a civil action, built on a case they couldn't even convict you on." Ellery said, "It's 12 years old, and it was garbage then. I have lawyers who eat garbage like that for breakfast. If even half of what you just told me is true, and I've spent 30 years learning to tell when a man is lying, and you are not, then we can reopen it. Whitfield's still around, you know. Failed up, the way they do. Runs his own fund now. There are people who'd love a reason to pull that thread. He pushed the card an inch closer. But that's the long game, and it's your choice. The short game is simpler. Come read the tape for me. Real money. Real desk. Your name on the door once we clear it. I don't care what school you went to, Tommy. I care that you saw Preston Vane's grave from across a dining room, and I've got a building full of Harvard MBAs who couldn't see it from inside his own book. And Tommy Herrera, standing in a cold alley at 1 in the morning, in a coat over a black vest, 12 years after the world had taken everything but the one thing it never understood he had, reached out, slowly, and took the card. What came after was not fast, because justice, when it comes at all, comes slowly, and Tommy had stopped believing in the fast kind long ago. But it came. Ellery Cole's lawyers pulled the thread on the old case, and the thread, as old buried threads do when someone finally pulls with real money behind them, began to unravel. Grant Whitfield, 12 years fatter and more careless and more certain of his own untouchability, had left tracks, the way men do when they have never once been caught. And more than that, the moment the case cracked back open, the moment there was finally someone powerful standing behind the immigrant kid instead of against him, other people came forward. A former compliance officer, retired now and carrying 12 years of guilt about the things she'd been pressured to sign. A junior from the old desk who had always known. The truth, once it has a champion, is very hard to keep buried. And Tommy Herrera's truth had waited 12 years for a champion, and now it had one. The compliance officer was the one who broke it open. Her name was Margaret Feld, and she had been the one, 12 years earlier, pressured into signing the internal report that made Tommy the villain, a report she had known, even as she signed it, was a lie and had carried like a stone in her chest every day since. When Ellery Cole's lawyers found her, retired and gray in a quiet town upstate, she did not need to be persuaded. She had been waiting, she said, for 12 years, for someone to knock on that door. She had kept a copy of the original findings, the real ones, the ones that pointed at Grant Whitfield, in a safe deposit box, insurance against a day she was no longer sure would ever come. I told myself I signed it to protect my career, she said, in the deposition, her voice steady, and I did protect my career. And I have hated myself for 12 years for what it cost that young man. So no, I don't need immunity. I need to tell the truth before I die. Write down that I said that. With Margaret Feld's original findings, the whole edifice the powerful had built came down with astonishing speed, because a lie only stands as long as no one with power is willing to push on it. And now someone was. Grant Whitfield, who had spent 12 years failing upward, running his own fund, sitting on the very boards that vetted men's reputations, secure in the belief that the past was a thing that happened to other people, got a call one afternoon from a lawyer whose name meant something, and by the end of that month, the man who had pinned his sin on an innocent finally learned what it was to be the one holding the bag. The regulators who had been so eager to accept the easy story 12 years ago were now, in a different climate, eager to be seen correcting it. Whitfield's career, the tainted monument built on Tommy's ruin, cracked and fell, and there was a certain terrible symmetry in it that Tommy did not celebrate but did, quietly, note that the same machine which had eaten the powerless to protect the powerful had, once someone finally reversed the current, eaten the powerful just as efficiently. It was never about justice, that machine. It was only ever about who had the leverage. For 12 years, Tommy had none. Now, through Ellery Cole and Margaret Feld's conscience, and one impossible glance across a dining room, he did. It did not fix everything. Let me be honest, because a true story is honest even when a satisfying one wouldn't be. It did not give him back the years. It did not undo the 3 in the morning nights or the slow suffocation that had cost him his marriage. His daughter was a young woman now, nearly grown, and the years he had missed were simply gone, a hole no verdict could fill. But it gave him back his name. The bar was overturned, a quiet settlement acknowledged, in the careful language of institutions that never quite say sorry, that a wrong had been done. Grant Whitfield, at long last, got his own phone call at midnight. and his own chair went over backward. And the man who had built his whole life on a sin he'd pinned to an innocent finally learned what it feels like to have the market and the law and the truth all come due at once. And Tommy Herrera walked onto a real trading desk at Ellery Cole's fund and sat down in front of real screens with a real account and did, in the light, with his name on it, the thing he had done in the dark for 12 years. He was, of course, extraordinary. The Harvard MBAs learned to go quiet when Tommy Herrera spoke because the quiet man in the corner who had read the tape for 12 years while carrying trays saw things they could not see and was right in ways that could not be explained by any pedigree. But the thing that changed that fund forever was not Tommy's returns, remarkable as they were. It was a rule he asked for, the only condition he set when he took the seat. He asked Ellery Cole to build a program, small at first, then not small, that went looking for the people the street had thrown away. The blackballed, the scapegoated, the brilliant outsiders with an accent and no pedigree and a whisper following them, the ones who could read the tape but would never be let in the room. "There are more of me," Tommy told him. "You have no idea how many. Men and women who can do this in their sleep and are parking your cars and clearing your plates because somebody with a name decided they didn't fit. Go find them. That's my condition. Go find the quiet ones." And Ellery Cole did, and the fund they built together became known, quietly, over the years, as the one place on Wall Street where they did not care what your last name was or what room you came up in, where the only question they asked was the only question the market itself had ever asked, which was whether you could see the truth. It became, of all things, a haven for the exact kind of person the street had spent a century discarding, and it made all of them, and Ellery and Tommy, an enormous amount of money, because it turns out that a machine built to find talent everyone else is too blind to see has a rather significant edge over machines built to hire the boss's nephew. Tommy's daughter came to see the new desk once. She was grown and cautious with him, as a child is cautious with a parent who was there and then gone through no fault either of them could fully explain. She stood in the trading room and looked at the screens and at the man her father had become, or rather the man he had always been, and had finally, at 48, been allowed to be. And she asked him the question that children of the ruined always eventually ask. "All those years," she said, "clearing their plates, letting them talk to you like that. How did you not break?" And Tommy Herrera thought about it, the way he thought about everything, carefully, all the way down. "For a long time," he said, "I thought the thing they took from me was my career. Then I thought it was your mother, and you, and the years. And they did take all of that, and I will grieve it until I die." He looked at the screens, at the numbers moving, at the one thing that had never once lied to him. "But they never took the eye, mija. They couldn't. It wasn't in the license, or the suit, or the room. It was in me. And every night for 12 years, when they thought I was nobody, I proved it to myself in the dark, on that old laptop, with nobody watching and nothing to gain." He smiled, small and certain. "That's the thing the loud ones never understand about the quiet ones. They think we're waiting to be let in. We're not. We're just waiting for the market to open, because the market never once asked our name, and it never once lied to us. And in the end, it's the only judge that can't be bought." He turned to her. Preston Vane had every advantage the world can give a man, and he couldn't see his own grave from inside his own book. "I saw it from across a room, in a vest, in one glance. Advantages aren't the same as the eye, mija. They never were. Remember that, and you'll never be afraid of a loud man again." If this story moved you, there's another waiting on your screen right now. A CEO who threw his coffee at the quiet man and told him to fetch, never knowing the quiet man signed his paychecks. Watch it next. And wherever you are tonight, remember, the one they don't bother to see is almost always the one who sees everything. The market never asks your name, and neither, in the end, does the truth.